Well, good morning. This is a revised introduction to our video. Jen, we've never actually done this before, but for both the video and the podcast, we have changed it. And the reason we've changed it is actually really boring and mundane. It's workflow. So you and I do the video, which then gets turned into the podcast before we write the dispatch. And this week, after we had done the video and after we had turned it into the podcast, what you
before
realized
we had actually written the dispatch,
before we'd written the dispatch, you were doing your dispatch work on that, and as you were investigating stuff, we realized that what's the best way to describe this? Basically, we just learned more about what we were going to write about.
Yes, I mean the problem and the challenge and what we've discovered, the issue with the workflow that we had tried out this week in our experimental sort of podcast situation was that, on the Thursday when we record the video, or Friday morning when we record the video, we have a general sense of what we're going to talk about, but it's a video about what we're going to write about. Hey, Matt, what are we going to write about this week? Oh, this. So, I mean, we have a general background research, but we haven't done our full research at that point. So, then Friday comes along, we'll sometimes put in calls. We'll do a little bit more research. We'll get more precise in terms of what we're trying to say for the written stuff. And then the written stuff will go out. And then at the same time, we'll blast the audio visual as well. Normally, that's not a problem because if there's something we need to get rid of from the audio visual or change or edit from the audio visual, we have time to do that in that process. But we're trying with this experimental podcast system. So we tried something new, and that was we blasted the podcast before we were done the written stuff. And we learned that was a mistake. We shouldn't have done that. We should have waited until we were totally comfortable with what we were going to say in the final dispatch before we blasted the podcast. So, oops. We made that was wrong. That was the incorrect workflow. We're still sorting ourselves out. We're still trying to figure out how to make the audio video side of this work without totally destroying our workloads. So sorry. This is an edited version of the video / podcast. We have just redacted a section here that we are going to talk about in this week in the written section of our dispatch, and we're going to talk about it next week in the audio video segment of next week's podcast and video, when we are a little bit more precise in our terminology and we're not off the cuff, and we're not quite so off the cuff about it. So apologies for that. If you were looking forward to the dispatch and then suddenly realized that if you were looking forward to our podcast and then suddenly realized that it had disappeared on you, that's why. All will be made clear in the next week or so. And that's about it.
And now on with the program. Well, hello. This is another line editor's video, and I guess saying this almost self-consciously, Jen, we expect now that this will be our second, still experimental podcast. Ooh, my video feed's cutting out. I'm vanishing. It was fun what we did last week. What I'm still trying to figure out for the podcast is how to just make it more seamless. It took me about an hour to turn our video into a podcast, but I have the feeling once I get better at this, I could maybe do it in 5 minutes. Like I was I'm
not trying to add additional burden. Yeah, I'm not trying to add additional burden to you. It's just that we're already doing these. Okay, so for people who don't know or have just catching in, we now do our weekly dispatch meeting. We do it as a Zoom video call, and then we're like, well, if we're doing this dispatch
which
meeting,
we put on
video
YouTube,
call, why don't we just put that on YouTube and make this like extra content? I mean, it's no extra work for us, or not really. So then we were like, well, if we're going to do this, why don't we just take the audio from our meeting and we'll turn it into a podcast, because you and I can gab on for hours. So we tried doing that for the first time last week. It seems to be really popular. Like people this actually is what a lot of our readers were asking for. They were asking for a Gerson Gurney podcast. And we're being really cheap and lazy about it, because we're literally just taking the audio from the video feed and then slapping it onto a podcast so that people can listen to it. So and we got like 1,500 downloads, which was pretty good for something we had no real intention or plan to launch or ability to do anything good with. So seems to be really popular. I do think that it's probably worth us investing, getting me a proper microphone and improving the audio quality a little bit.
I will just send one out. I mean, I have the advantage here, Jen, that I do my radio show from home, so I already have a broadcast suite. Like it's kind of improvised, basically. Like I do my radio show from home, and then I take all the stuff away and I put it in the closet, right? And then the next morning, it only takes me like a minute or two to set up, but it's some sound baffling and some things like that. So I have the advantage of that already. So the marginal costs of me getting set up like that are pretty modest. Your disadvantage, and it's a cute one, is your kids are still in the age where they just want to walk all over you and be interrupting you.
Yes. So
my daughter did.
There's nothing to be done about that. They will continue to interrupt videos and podcast streams. And sorry, audience, it's just what it is.
My daughter once, when I was live on the air hosting a radio show for CJAD in Montreal, my daughter escaped my wife and got downstairs. And I have my microphone live, and I'm speaking with my big radio voice into the microphone, and then I just hear, "Daddy, what are you doing?" And it startled me, because she had snuck up right behind me and her voice was picked up by the microphone, which put it right into my ears. So I was like, "Ah!"
Oh.
And then luckily we had a caller on the air at the time, and it sounded like it was on the caller's end, but no, it was my daughter escaping containment. All right, so this is going to be an unusual video, actually, because I am bringing nothing to the table. And that was true a couple of weeks ago. When I just come back from vacation. It's not true today. I'm fully caught up in the news schedule, but basically this week, like, you were just pumping the notes of it. We should talk about this. We should talk about this. We should talk about this. So let me moderate, but these are mostly ideas you bring to the table. Let's start with Jennifer Gerson versus the baby boomers.
Oh, good. Yes, let's definitely start that. So the baby boomers got a little angry at me today. This week they got a little triggered by something I wrote. I just did an angry screed about housing and why there was no government that was ever going to fix housing policies. We have basically an entrenched system where nobody is going to allow housing prices to go down, because too many people have now bought in and have too much of their family's net worth hooked up in housing. And so therefore, all of these housing policies are a giant joke, because none of them are actually going to reduce the cost of housing. In fact, some of them will do the exact opposite.
Will make it worse. Yeah, they're pumping more money into a market where prices are already being bid up on insufficient inventory.
That's right. And like the housing crisis is a really complicated phenomenon. There's a lot of reasons for it, from everything from speculation to building codes, lack of tradespeople, lack of materials, immigrants are coming in, there's not enough, there's reason after reason after reason. But I mean, you can't look at our housing policies and fail to note that there is in fact a pretty significant intergenerational injustice happening. And I think even Chrystia Freeland said that pretty openly, and that is, the boomers basically got to take advantage of 50, 60 years of a fairly extraordinary increase in economic growth and prosperity in the post-war era, with the 80s aside. Mm-hmm. They've enjoyed the last 4 decades of extraordinary house price value increases, wildly beyond either wage inflation or inflationary justifications. We're in a speculative bubble that's way beyond what could be justified by any other kind of underlying economic metric. And that this is happening at the expense of younger Canadians. If you're entering the housing market right now, you are paying through the nose for a very, very marginal type of house. And this is a stark contrast to the realities that a lot of the boomers themselves faced when they were entering the housing market. So noting that is just and by the way, the baby boomers right now, unlike the stereotype, of the poor retiree, are in fact the wealthiest demographic in the country.
And you'll always have individual baby boomers going, "Oh yeah, well, I'm dirt poor." Yeah, but okay, but look at the charts.
Exactly. And this is I think the important thing to know. We're talking about macroeconomic trends. We're talking about demographics. Failings. This is not about personal failings. Yeah. It's not about your personal triumphs. It's not about your personal anything. An individual baby boomer who is now sitting on 6 or 7 figure net wealth has done nothing wrong. And I think that needs to be said very clearly. As an individual, you've done nothing wrong to take advantage of this housing market. Of course you have. My parents have, I would have, like, that's it. But what I think is what I think is very interesting was how many baby boomers took this column very personally. They thought it was a personal attack on them and their ability to earn and their right to be wealthy. And firstly, it wasn't. I don't think any individual suffers any kind of shame or anything of the sort for having had the good fortune of doing well in a growing economy. I mean, that's fine, just as long as you recognize that your hardship and struggle and work was done in a larger macroeconomic environment that allowed you to take advantage of those things to the utmost effect. I mean, the phrase "you were born on third base" kind of applies here. Now, let's not take this serious. Millennials and Gen Z, we were all born on second base. Like, nobody's claiming that we are struggling by any historic generational standard. Like, my quality of life and my opportunities are wildly better than my grandparents were, or their grandparents were. I mean, like, that's not in dispute. We were definitely born on second base, but we weren't born on third in the same way that our parents were. There's a shift in opportunity and a shift in openings, and that's just a reality. And it's not like, I'm not angry about it. That's just life. But at the same time, I can also say, hey, that's life, and point to the fact that there are specific government policies that are being put in place to exacerbate that disparity and are going to make it work and are operating for the benefit of one generation at the direct expense of another. And a lot of boomers got really offended by that. They took that really, really personally. They were like, yeah, but I lost everything in the 80s. And I'm like, okay, when your major hardship, that financial hardship that you need to go back to point to, happened 40 years ago, like, you've had it pretty good by any historic standard. Let's just put that there. And then the other thing I would point out is just, it does seem to me like a lot of people in that particular demographic, and again, I'm generalizing, I don't think this is the case in all cases, but there are a lot of boomers who are not accustomed to, how should I say this? Taking a lot of flack for this. They're not accustomed to talking about intergenerational inequities, and they are, I think, a lot of them put a lot of their own self-worth into their ability to have been successful and to have earned a lot of money and to have something to pass on to their kids and all the rest. They find a lot of self-worth in that. So when you go into them and say stuff like, okay, well,
basically, like, you lucked out. Like, you won. You
kind of lucked out. And that's not to diminish the fact that you also worked hard and did everything right, but you worked hard and did everything right in an environment that was extremely lucky for you in a bigger picture. There are a lot of individual boomers who will take that and be like, well, wait, you're saying that I'm not wholly I'm not wholly responsible for the benefits I've enjoyed, and that seems to affect some boomers' sense of self-worth and sense of identity in a really interesting way. So they take it really personally.
Let me tell you what this is: boomer privilege.
Yeah, that's right.
And people react to the concept of boomer privilege in the same way that some people react to the concept of white privilege. Or
that's right.
And
except that boomer privilege is like really easy to quantify in a way.
I mean, sure. Look at the wealth charts. Yeah. Look, I have always believed in white privilege. I am white privilege, and I've always said that. Of course, my life has been easier because I'm a member of the locally dominant racial and sort of, or even socioeconomic group. I think we see, when we have these arguments, right, you talk about the undeniable fact that the boomers have benefited from a macroeconomic environment that is no longer operative, particularly not even just for millennials and younger. Like, there actually is an interesting cutoff. Your husband's a couple years older than you, right? He's closer to my age.
Yes, about 7. Yeah, he's 7 years older than me.
Okay, then he's older than me. I'm only about 3 years older than you. So.
And he's enjoyed advantages that I couldn't have dreamed of. Yes.
Yeah, and our friends who are 4 years behind us couldn't keep
We're
up
way
with
more
us.
fucked than we are.
Like
way more screwed than we
the
are.
curtain fell really quickly. And
Yeah.
I don't know if it divided the millennial generation evenly. Like we'd have to look at the actual age charts on that. But so I'm a millennial. I'm about as old as a millennial can be by about
So am
like,
I. Like
by about a year.
you'd put me as an older millennial as well.
Yeah, and I'm one of the oldest millennials. I think anyone more than like 11 months older than me is not considered a millennial. So I barely make it. But my friends, the people I grew up with who are the same age as me, most of them own homes. Like they don't always own the best home or in the neighborhood they might want to be. But and this is, again, I'm acknowledging my biases and my privilege. This reflects the neighborhood I grew up in, the circles I travel in. But home ownership was possible for, I think, a lot, maybe not most, but a lot of the people who were born in the early 80s. If you're born in the late 80s, you're fucked.
Totally different ballgame.
Because the curtain had fallen. If you're born in the late 90s, it's like buying a home is like science fiction.
Well, and also I would narrow that down even further. And I would say what's also interesting is you look at even on our careers. I mean, I came into journalism and I graduated high school 2002, came into journalism kind of 2006. So things were definitely getting rocky, like they were on the way out. But there was still a path for me to carve out a career there in a conventional way. I had a series of internships, I had a series of sort of mentorships, and like I was able to get jobs in mainstream newsrooms and things like that. And like, don't get me wrong, it's not like everybody in my age group was doing that, but that pathway was still possible. It was still there. And somebody who's coming out of journalism 15 years later now, no hope. There's just, it's done, it's gone. So it's like, it would be so disingenuous and so oblivious for me to go to someone who's 22 today and be like, well, I don't get it. Why don't you just get an internship at the Globe? Like, what's your problem? Why can't you get into journalism? Like that would be ridiculous for me to say that, because that world that I came up in has collapsed. It's gone. It's like I'm like in one of those cartoons where, you're running off this, like in DuckTales, when you're running off the side of the building, and as you run, the little crumbles behind you fall into the abyss. Like, I've been extremely lucky and extremely privileged to have been born at the exact moment that I was and taken advantage of the exact moment that I did. But I try to explain that to people who are in their 60s and 70s now, and some of them get it. A lot of them are really smart. A lot of them get it, and some of them just give you this look like they don't, like, why don't you just save more money? And I'm like, because they can. Like, this is the problem, and the idea that these sorts of different macroeconomic realities don't affect generations profoundly, I think, is really wrong. But anyway, the point being is that we definitely had a couple of boomers who took real offense at the fact that I was a bit strident in this column. They definitely took it personally in a way that firstly, they took it personally in a way that I found really interesting and weird, because to me it said a lot about what they valued in themselves as a human being, and I don't know, a little bit of narcissism there, I think, as well. It's like there's a big the boomer generation has is profiting at the expense of the younger generation, is not a comment on you personally. For all I know, I'm presuming that every boomer reader of the line is a wonderful human being who knits kitten paws for orphan kittens and everything. Like I'm not assuming anything bad about any individual boomer. This is not a you as a boomer are bad because you're a boomer. You took advantage of the market you had. Good on you. Get your money. Like, great. I'm just saying, this is just the economic situation we're in now as a result of some of the policies that we've put in place that haven't benefited you at the expense of other generations. That's just something that needs to be acknowledged, frankly. Then the other thing
Sorry, I just want to say, if people are watching the video right now, might think I'm not paying attention to what you're saying. I am. And if you're listening to the podcast, you won't know this. I've been staring down at my desk. What I'm doing, Jen, is I'm adding up how much money I've made since I became a journalist, and I'm rounding it off. I'm like, what my starting salary was, and then I'm going to knock 40% off of that for tax, and I'm going to figure out if I could afford a downtown house. If I'd waited a few years, I would have been screwed. Now, I'm about 3 years older than you, but you and I actually were getting into journalism at almost the exact same time. If anything, you were a bit ahead of me, because I did like a grad school meandering thing. You got a journalism BA and went right into it, right?
Well, that's because, I mean, and this is where we get into socioeconomic status classes, is that I didn't come from a particularly wealthy family. and
You had to just start working.
I had to start working.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't have money. Like my parents helped me out a little bit with tuition, but I worked my way through university, and I wanted to work. I wanted to be a journalist. And so when I graduated, I had actually been working for 2 years at the Toronto Star, and I had an internship, a paid internship behind my belt. Again, opportunities that just aren't there anymore.
Yeah.
And I was able to pay for my education. Well, a huge part of my living expenses for my education with a union job at the Toronto Star.
Yeah.
You know, in the radio room in particular. So that gave me a great position to sort of get into internships after I graduated, and I just started working right away. But like, there was no fucking gap year. Like, no, there was no, oh, maybe you'll go to Columbia. Nobody in my family's gonna pay for my trip to Columbia. Like, you know what I mean? Like, there was not gonna be, I took a vacation in Paris for a week, and that was exciting, but there was not gonna be the grand European tour. You know, it was the fact that I was able to go to Toronto to go pursue a, as my mom would put it, bohemian career in the first place, was like, all right, I'd much prefer you to like stay at UBC and, you know, get a degree in poli science so you can become a secretary, like a sensible, like, you know what I mean? Like, that was like a normal person. Like, what is wrong with you? And you know, you can definitely tell this is a conversation that you and I have had, is like the socioeconomic status, you know, frames your expectations of what you can achieve, because the idea of economic insecurity was not something that I was able to bear at that particular point in my life. And I had to work. Yeah. So that was it. And I just worked. And I think you're right. There was a moment, like, I think you and I, if we did the math on this, we could go and look at our peers and find the exact year when the gate snapped shut on journalism. Right.
Well, I mean, what I would have to do, I would have to text Robin Urbach, who's currently a columnist at the Globe and Mail. I'd ask what year I hired her. And then that would basically be the cutoff, because after that, there was no. Yeah. Like that, we didn't really get in anyone after that. So yeah. I've done the math, taking every penny I have earned since I became a journalist 14 years ago. And obviously my tax rate has changed with my income level, but I've wiped out 40% of that for taxes. Okay.
Yep.
I could afford 26% of my house. And that's, ooh, I'm honestly using a pretty low estimate for the value of my house. So every single dollar I have ever made, and as you know, I rose fairly quickly at the Post, and I ended up breaking into the ranks of senior managers, and then I've jumped to other jobs since. But I've done what people do. They jump from job to job to job, and they improve their circumstances. Now I'm a freelancer, and I'm doing better than I was before. But it's just, so for people who would make the why don't you save more money argument, if I had never spent a single penny that I had earned on anything other than housing, if every single penny I have ever earned since I was fresh out of grad school had gone entirely to housing, I could afford 27% of my house.
Which means you could barely afford a typical uninsured down payment. You would be just over that.
It would mean the entire time, for that entire time, I would have had to have been I think for that entire time, my wife and I have been together, but we weren't, like, at the early phase of this, we were just dating, right? So if she had been able to put every scrap of food on the table, every article of clothing on my back, my cell phone plan, everything, you would have been able to afford a 20%, basically roughly a 20% down payment on the house with us. You would have been able to get the down payment on your current house uninsured. Yeah. Yeah. But then when you actually factor in land transfer taxes and things like that, not really, less than that. Well, there's the 7% would be gone. So, and then also, if I assume I don't know how much my house is worth because of how insane the real estate market is. Like, my best and worst case scenarios are about $500,000 apart. If I take the high end, I could not have afforded a down payment on the house I live in if I'd put every single penny I've ever made in journalism into it. Actually, you know what? Not even in journalism, anything. And I have been lucky enough to break through and to be on the relatively high end paid of this gig in my time. I couldn't afford the house I live in, even if every last. That's why my husband and I were like, we can't go back to Toronto because that's nuts. We just stayed in Calgary. And Calgary is one of the few cities in Canada still where you can get a very decent little house for $500,000. That's quickly changing, but
you can still, even here it's changing, but you can still get a reasonable house for a reasonable fee in Calgary.
You know
Now,
what's
that being
interesting
said,
too?
so anyway, that I want to circle back because I don't really want to spend this whole time talking about housing, but like because the point I was trying to make is the boomer hate. There's a couple of little things I want to note about this in the dispatch. One of them is we actually did lose some paid subscribers who were very angry at us. And the point I just want to say is thank you very much for coming and goodbye. Because, you know, if you are coming to the line as a paid subscriber thinking that you are going to never be offended, never be upset by anything we write, never be challenged by anything we write, then you're not here for the right reasons. You're here because you think that this is somebody, that we're a group of people who are just going to rail against the millennial wokies and always affirm your beliefs and give you happy feelings in the world. I have no doubt that we would make more money if that were our journalism model, but it isn't, and we're not. So that's what it is.
Well, look,
and that's it. Part of our journalism ethic is always about accepting rebuttals. So if you think I'm wrong, write me a rebuttal that isn't "you hurt my feelings."
We did lose. We got some snarky emails. We had some immediate cancellation subscriptions, but I did check our numbers this morning. We had a lot of activity yesterday, but we are net positive 4 new subscribers. So we did lose a bunch.
Welcome.
But a bunch of new people signed on, and we can track this. They signed on entirely because of your column. So
okay. And thank you.
So it was a net winner. The only thing I say is I think it's 2 things. I've already mentioned boomer privilege as it goes with white privilege, right? People have a hard time separating their personal experiences from their demographic or macroeconomic circumstances, right? I think you've already said that. People have that self-image. The other thing that I think comes up, and I don't know if this is a human thing or a Canadian thing in particular, the wealthy are uncomfortable with being wealthy. Like you have to be either very wealthy or particular personality to be comfortable being wealthy. And I think some people, particularly boomers, well, it's been said of our politics, right? I try to remember who said this. Was it Stephen Gordon, the economist at Laval, who used to work with us at the Post? I think he pointed out everyone thinks they're middle class.
Yeah.
Like you've got the desperately poor, you've got the fantastically rich, and those are a couple of percentage points at either end of the spectrum. And then you've got like 97% of humanity, 98% of humanity maybe, who thinks they're middle class.
And also, I think part of the reason why the column bothered a couple, and not all, but a couple of the boomers, is that honestly, I think it's a guilty conscience. Part of the defensiveness just reeks of I've earned my wealth. God damn it! I'm not going to be told otherwise. I'm not going to be told that I do not deserve the money that I've been given. I did all the right things. If you didn't do the right things, you were a moral failure in a way that I'm not. I deserve this, and it's because there's an unacknowledged guilty conscience there, because you have to know that even if you did work your ass off and you did all the right things, the fact that you had the opportunity to work your ass off, the fact that you had the opportunity to put your money in Apple at the right moment, and the Apple happened to do really well, these were things that were ultimately beyond your control and the result of macroeconomic factors that benefited you, and that you did nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. You succeeded. Go you, go capitalism, rah, rah, rah. But let's acknowledge that luck played a huge factor there. And I think people are really uncomfortable with that.
We've already been talking too long. We've been gabbing.
Oh my gosh, we are so gabby.
We are gabby. We're talking about legacy media though. Let's just quickly mention the new Toronto Star CEO and her tweets. The executives are not the journalists. And everyone always assumed Godfrey was telling us directly what to dictate. Look, the publisher or the CEO would occasionally care. They don't care.
Occasionally.
We need this covered.
They would come down, or they would say occasionally they would come down and be like, for a major election, we're going to endorse this person, and that's going to be. The company is picked, and with the editorial board guys, which has always been a tradition in newspaper. This is every time that there's like some kind of unsigned editorial endorsement, people are scandalized without realizing this is like a tradition that goes back to the beginning of 200 years. Newspapers.
The firewall between executive ownership and editorial newsroom, we could talk about it in highfalutin terms of integrity and journalism. It's actually much more cynical than that. It's benign neglect. They
And they
let
don't
us
give a shit.
continue to do what we do, and they go try and sell the advertisements.
As far as the executive is concerned, the newsroom is the thing that absorbs money and doesn't make money. That's it. We're the unfortunate appendage. We are literally the meat section of the grocery store. You can't not have us there because then nobody comes into the store.
Yeah.
But we only cost money.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we are to the CEO. So anyway, the reason why we bring up all of this information is because there was a new CEO of the Toronto Star. Her name apparently is Marina Glogovac. I don't know anything about her, although I'm going to start poking around. So when it was announced that she was going to be named the new CEO of the Toronto Star, of course, people start digging around and they find quote unquote bad tweets, such as this one, which I'm going to quote now, to David Fisman. This was March 11th, 2022. So like a month ago. The rest of the world has moved on, and all other provinces. We are actually the last one to follow. So the frame of references and hundreds of other experts all throughout Europe and the US, both blue and red states, support this. The pandemic is over. Time to heal and unite. So firstly, all of these tweets, by the way, that have been flagged as bad tweets are maybe like bad tweets in the context of a very liberal, very downtown COVID hysteric crowd. But like, I'm reading this and nothing here offends me. She has an opinion, like who cares? But anyway, so David Fisman, of course, retweets this and says, new CEO of the Toronto Star, thoughts? And then her response to this was, David, respectfully, don't want to feel persecuted by you for a personal opinion from a month ago as a free and private citizen. It has nothing to do with my new role. I'm fully vaccinated and support the current public health guidance. Should be able to dialogue in a democracy. Marina here is 100% correct. I mean, firstly, like, as a private citizen, you are allowed to have opinions that differ from the opinions of David Fisman, also known as the guy who called the conservatives literal Nazis because he was counting the number of characters in their official Twitter accounts' tweets and found out that a couple of them happened to come out to the number 88. And I would certainly question whether or not David Fisman's personal stamp of approval is necessary or required for a private citizen, for the acceptability of a private citizen's opinions. Is that the gentlest way that I can put that?
I mean, literally the gentlest way of putting it is that you don't think he gets a veto of over what other people think. And
I don't think that he gets a veto over what's considered acceptable.
Yeah.
Period. There's nothing. Marina's statements and tweets, like I said, might not go over particularly well in a very, very progressive, uber liberal kind of downtown Toronto space. That does not disqualify her from being the CEO of Torstar at all.
Yeah. I continue to value a lot of what Fisman tweets, right? Because he actually continues to post really interesting information about airflow mechanics and UV sterilization of air. I've found him a valuable resource, but I think what we have seen over this pandemic is I find this really interesting. We have seen some of what you and I have kind of collectively referred to them as the Twitter doctors. And we don't even necessarily mean that derogatively. Like, there are people who have medical expertise who have become prominent commentators throughout the pandemic. Some of them are now declaring outright their partisan affiliations. They're running for political office. They're securing nominations. Remember, Ontario has a provincial election coming up in 2 months. So we're in the nominations phase. I haven't been surprised yet to see what someone's political affiliation has been, right? And
yeah.
I don't know what Fisman's political affiliations are. I know he's tweeted about politics. I don't follow that closely. It's just, it struck me as twofold. There's the very basic issue you're raising, which is that comments made by a private citizen or comments made by a private citizen. I also think it's just really, when I saw the people trying to, hey, look what the CEO of the Star is saying. How are the Star people going to find out about this? People who say this are just not appreciating how much the executives ignore the journalists in any large journalism company.
Above and beyond that is someone in her position if the Torstar CEO said, hey, I think that it's time for us to move on from the pandemic, is that really such an egregious, terrible, unacceptable position that we need to like get her pushed out of the job as Torstar CEO? Like, and like there's a couple other tweets and stuff like that. I mean, I think there's one that was kind of a little nutty about vaccines and things like that. But like she's not an anti-vaxxer by any stretch. But I mean, what would be a disqualifying opinion for a Torstar CEO? I think is an interesting question.
It is an interesting
question.
Actually,
now that I think about it, that is an interesting question. I don't think anything she's posted
would be that
meeting the standard for qualifying. I mean, if she were out there spewing hate speech against an identifiable group, I think that would be a disqualifying opinion for someone in a high public company like that.
But I mean, not even specifically.
I do think there would be. No, not even specifically Torstar.
Let me ask you the question.
I do think there is a line, but like I don't think she's met it.
Let me ask you the question a different way. There's a CEO of a journalism company under any obligations beyond what the CEO of any large company would be under? Like, is there something that would be acceptable if you were running a hedge fund or an auto parts maker or an artisanal bakery chain or something like that? That would be totally fine, but that's not the sort of thing that would be acceptable in journalism. Unless it was something actually like the journalists are enemies of the people.
Yeah, no, but that's what I was about to say. I would be like, I wouldn't want the CEO of a journalist company to have profoundly liberal views about journalism
itself. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that if you're going to be the CEO of a journalism focused company, you should have some pretty strident views about the value of journalism.
Seems fair.
I would expect that. But like, so here's would be an interesting Greer. What if Marina were a strident anti-vaxxer, sincerely thought the vaccines were.
But she was an incredible CEO who would effectively manage Torstar and keep 100 journalists employed.
Yeah. What then? Right? Like that.
I mean, there's the right answer and then there's the real answer. I would say the right answer is that it doesn't matter so long as you are acting appropriately within your job and you're doing.
Yeah, so long as she's not trying to as long as she's not trying to push like anti-vaxxer stuff into editorial, which was, as we've established, a CEO wouldn't be normal for a CEO to do.
No, and there would be chains of command and lines of defense. They're not. I'm not an idealist about this. I think a lot of the traditional editorial firewalls have been broken down as the media companies have contracted and become more vulnerable. You're definitely more vulnerable as a media company today to special interests because your revenue streams are so narrow. So I'm not naive about this. But overall, there would be a massive editorial resistance to that kind of an order. And you and I both know the Star's editor-in-chief, Emma, would quit. She would just quit. Like it wouldn't happen.
No, it wouldn't happen.
But I think, it's interesting. Like I think in terms of what would disqualify a CEO of a journalism company, even if she was totally raging anti-vaxxing, I don't know. I mean, some of the journalists might be uncomfortable working for that kind of a person.
But here's what I would argue is that a CEO has a public-facing role, and that a CEO's opinion
should not be batshit.
Well, it shouldn't reflect in a derogatory way on the company as a whole.
Yeah.
So, like, I think that if she were like full-on trucker convoy, anti-masker, for a company like Torstar, which has traditionally aligned itself with more leftist and progressive values, that would potentially be a conflict that would be difficult to overcome from an optics perspective. I would agree with that. I don't think I don't think that her presence would be a threat to the editorial side at all, but I do think it would potentially present an optics issue. The issue that I have is like the stuff that's being flagged as like problematic tweets is just not that. I mean, unless I'm missing something, and forgive me if I am, like I do think there was.
She has sanitized her Twitter account, I believe. So by the time I was looking at it, there wasn't much of note, objectionable or otherwise.
I do think she said something a little bit about a little bit skeptical about Pfizer. So like there was a little bit of that, but I don't think she was a full-on raging anything really. So here we go. I'm just gonna go here.
I mean, to me, I think
It does not matter what he thinks. It matters what Pfizer executive thinks and want. We're witnessing a policy at government capture by a massive corrupt drone corporation. Dig deeper, folks. So there's a couple sort of slightly.
That's not great, but
it's not great. But I mean, I lived the first 26 years of my life, and like you presume, I think she's coming from a communist country. Here we are. Oh, here we have a curious and powerful emergence of quote unquote mass formation of psychological phenomenon that has enabled all totalitarian regimes, us versus them, passports, membership, segregation, those with resources wins. Okay, so mass formation is a particular sort of, I hate to use the word dog whistle, but it's a particular statement that goes back to some stuff that was passed around in Joe Rogan that assumed that a lot of the behavioral stuff that we're seeing around COVID, I mean, I'm noting that a lot of people seem to have gone a little nutty, is something called mass formation psychosis. So it's a kind of like a wonky theory that doesn't really have evidence, but it does allude to the kind of collective stuff that we do tend to see in totalitarian regimes. And I don't think that's particularly controversial. She's making a particular note here, which does suggest that she's sort of stridently anti-communist.
yeah,
I would understand if she comes from a communist country, is understandable. She's probably a little bit more on the libertarian side. She's skeptical of authority would be sort of how I read this. It's like, I don't think that a tweet like this or like these are disqualifying for her as a role as a CEO remotely. I don't think that, but it does show that she is outside the norm of what I would expect to see in, like I said, fairly lefty downtown Toronto circles.
Yeah.
Certainly.
What do we actually want to write in the dispatch?
I will write something about
Boomers.
boomer hate. Boomers
Boomer
who
hate.
hate me now. Also,
You know what? For what it's worth, a lot of boomers agreed with you, by the way.
a lot of boomers were lovely. Like there, and in our comments too, we had some really lovely, like genuinely, like oh, like nice boomers who like really get it, who really 100% get it, and are genuinely worried about their kids, are genuinely worried about where this goes as a society. Like, man, I am not putting every boomer in the same bucket here, but that's another conversation. Anyway, I'll do boomer hate. Do you want to take on Fisman versus the Star CEO? Because I think that like the more we started, I thought it was just a funny throwaway tweet, but the more we started talking about it, the more I'm just like, there's actually some interesting ideas to unpack here.
Yep, no, I can do that. Anything on the broader COVID front or Ukraine front worth mentioning?
Oh yeah, I don't care about COVID anymore. And
I love that the Ukrainians zapped that ship, or apparently zapped
it was
that
funny.
ship.
Yeah. Apparently, according to the Kiev Independent, Trudeau made some comments sort of acknowledging that Ukraine is in a state of genocide.
Oh, they know that Russia's. Yeah, I mean, look, yeah, he did. President Biden and Justin Trudeau both had said this week that Russia is committing genocide in Ukraine, to which I would refer them back to our dispatch of last week and go, no, they're not.
Well, and not only that, but I mean, like, it's a quintessentially Trudeau-y thing to do, to be like, great, we'll acknowledge that you're going through a genocide and do nothing about it. So now instead, so it's not really a genocide, but we'll give you that sop so that now we can continue to not put on a no-fly zone instead of in front of an active genocide instead of mere war atrocities. You know what I mean? Like here's your consolation prize.
I think it's what I said to you last week. Unless you condemn or praise something in the most maximalist possible terms, you're a fence sitter. So if something's bad, you got to use the worst possible terminology to describe it. If something's good, you have to laud it. I've said this before to you. I don't know if I've ever said it publicly like this, but one of the most threatened rights right now in terms of our cultural moment is the right to not have a strong opinion on something. It's the right to either have zero opinion on something or to be kind of lukewarm on it and be like, yeah, I can see what you're saying, but I'm not that passionate about it. We live in a cultural moment where everybody needs to be on the right side of something. And obviously they will decide for themselves which side is the right side, but just not caring is really hard right now. And I'm not saying I don't care about Ukraine. I'm just saying all of our instincts right now are honed to whatever position I'm going to take it all the way. So if the Russian invasion of Ukraine is bad, it's genocide. No, it's just bad. It's really bad. It is horrific. Like Ukrainians found another mass grave this week, but by the definitions of genocide we're using here, every war in history has been genocidal. And if every war in history has been genocidal, genocide has no meaning. Like
yeah, it's just war. Then
well,
it's just
like we said last week, words mean things. They have meanings. They have specific meanings, and we come up
And
with
we're
new
going to be the bad pedantic assholes that are going to make that point. So I think you should take that one.
Yeah. Okay. I'll repeat.
And it
that.
doesn't
So
it
I'll
doesn't
do
need to
that.
be a
I'll
big
do-
expanse because we've already kind of addressed the core piece of it.
Yep.
But I just think it's just interesting to point out how absolute of course he acknowledged it was genocide. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like,
And what are we going to do
course.
about it? Stuff.
Nothing. Yeah, exactly. There never again will we allow genocide except for this genocide, which we're going to acknowledge as a genocide and then do nothing about. Okay.
The only other thing I would mention, and we'll say this in signing off, is happy Easter, happy Passover, happy Ramadan for those who are continuing to celebrate, and to the non-religious among you, have a great long weekend. That's all I got.
All right, excellent. I mean, I'm still bitter about the snow, but that's fine. Also, happy Easter to everybody and all the holidays.
All the holidays. Okay,
All
thanks
holidays.
everybody. We will be off. I think Monday we're taking off.
Yeah, we're taking off Monday, and then we'll be back
Okay.
probably Tuesday. Do another
All right.
short week next week.
Yep, works for me. Okay, thanks everybody. Take care.